Hello, I greet you in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. What I'm going to do this evening is start a new series. I've already done it in Portuguese, and in Portuguese I called it a workshop, so I just kept on calling it a workshop 2022. That doesn't mean anything, don't worry about it. It's going to be in 4 sections. The first section is this one now. I'm going to be dealing with errors and contradictions that the so-called critical text has introduced into the New Testament text. After that, I'll go on to apparent difficulties and so on. We'll get there in time. But before talking about the errors and contradictions, we're going to deal with them one by one. I need to mention this work. This is a reprint. This is not, of course, the original, but that's Codex B and its Allies, a study and indictment by Herman C. Hoskier. This was published, I think, in 1916, if I remember correctly. 2 volumes. The first volume is about 500 pages. It deals with hundreds of obvious mistakes in Codex B. And the second volume is a little bit shorter, 450 pages, does the same thing for Codex Aleph. There are hundreds of cases, objectively bad, obviously wrong readings. And that did not include just mistakes in spelling or witticisms and that kind of stuff. Well, I wanted you to know that when I say that Codex B is of objectively inferior quality, or if I say that Codex Aleph is of objective inferior quality, and so for others that are of a similar sort, I am basing it on this work by Hoskier. If you haven't ever read that, you ought to read it. Not only that, of course, if you compare Codices B and Aleph, which are supposedly the 2 big ones in the 4 Gospels, they disagree between themselves over 3,000 times. That's quite apart from spelling mistakes and witticisms. Over 3,000 times they disagree. One or the other has to be wrong, right? They can't both be right. Matter of fact, many times they are both wrong, but one or the other has to be wrong. Those are just simply not good manuscripts. You try it sometime. You try writing, say, the Gospel of Mark and see how many mistakes you manage to make. You're not going to make 100. You're not going to make hundreds of mistakes. Not if you're a serious person. Okay, that was just by way of background. Now I'm going to give you an introduction. Alan, come in, please. The purpose of this series of videos is to list and discuss the errors of fact and the outright contradictions, as well as glaring aberrations that are found in the so-called critical text. It's really an eclectic text, Greek text, a text that, in fact, dominates the academic world. And those are things that the editors, sons of disobedience, all of them, purposely introduced into the Greek text of the New Testament, making it virtually impossible to defend the inerrancy of that text. I will start now with some errors of fact, and the first one is found in Luke 4:44. The very end of chapter 4 of Luke. The question is, was Jesus teaching in the synagogues of Galilee, or was he doing that in the synagogues of Judea? As you will see from the evidence there on the screen, aside from Family 35, which is the line of transmission that I am translating, or have translated rather, and is in my Greek text. And the evidence here that I'm giving is to be found in my critical apparatus of my Greek text. It's not in the 3rd edition, but any one of the 3 editions. Virtually 95%. Well, one other thing, when you see that I have the percentage within parentheses, that's taken from Textwort, a series put out by the Institute in Munster, Germany, and since they collated 1,500 or whatever manuscripts, it's probably very close to the final word. Where where my percentages are not based on text note, you'll see square brackets, and that's my extrapolation based on the available information here, there, and yonder. But here, this particular case is found in text note. So you see the percentages within parentheses. Just about 95% have in the synagogues of Galilee, 4% have the synagogues of Judea, and you also have the early manuscripts of 575, Aleph, B, C, and Q. Okay, what's the problem? Why do I talk about this? Well, Jesus was in Galilee and continued there, not in Judea, as the context makes perfectly clear. Both Mark and Luke affirm, in fact, that Jesus was in Capernaum. And obviously, Capernaum is in Galilee, not in Judea. So, I carry on discussing it in this way. In the parallel passage, that's in Mark chapter 1, verses 35 to 39, all manuscripts, all texts agree that Jesus was in Galilee. Therefore, the critical text, I have NU, that N stands for Nestle Alant and the U for UBS. It contradicts itself by reading Judea in Luke 4:44, but reading Galilee in Mark 1, which are obviously a parallel passage. Now, fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, but from my point of view, fortunately, one of the four editors that produced the initial series, UBS 1 and 2, there was Matthew Allant, Kurt Allant, Matthew Black, Bruce Metzger, and Ellen Wickren. And Metzger wrote a textual commentary on their work that was published in 1971 by the United Bible Societies. You'll see what I say here on pages 137 and 8. Okay, now going back to my text here, I say Metzger makes clear that the new editors did this on purpose when he explains that their reading, quote, is obviously the more difficult, and copyists have corrected it in accord with the parallels in Matthew 4:23 and Mark 1:39. That's Metzger, okay, one of the four editors. Therefore, the new or UBS editors, they introduce a contradiction into their text, which is also an error of fact, and they did it on purpose. Unfortunately, this error in the eclectic text is reproduced by Living Bible, New International Version, ASB, etc., etc., etc. Not only that, however, it's not a case of 95% against 4%. There is confusion among the 4% to such an extent that the exact prepositional phrase that is published by the critical text, estas synagogas ates iuadai, there's a mistake there. Yeah. Oh, here it's okay. In the one on the screen it's correct. Thanks. That particular spelling and such is only in 0.8%, less than 1% of the manuscript. So we have here, as we'll have over and over again, a patchwork quilt. Okay, now I go on to another problem. It happens also to be in Luke chapter 3 and verse 33. This is right in the middle of Mary's genealogy. The true reading, as attested by 95% of the manuscripts, is of Aminadab of Aram. Now, most versions will say the son of, or the son of the son of, or something. Luke did not write that. Luke did not write the son of. He just wrote of. The son is only at the very beginning. There's a good reason for that, which I explained elsewhere. But now let's look at what we have here. What the critical text, so-called eclectic text, does is produce a patchwork quilt. That is, tu Aminadab, tu Admin, tu Ani is not found in a single manuscript. That is a pure invention on their part. Not a single manuscript, not one. As you look down the list on the next page as well, you'll see that Codex B has its private reading, Codex Aleph has a private reading, and on and on. Family 13 has a private reading, codices X, L, N, and so on, all private readings. There's total confusion. Total confusion. But this admin and RD are fictitious, purely fictitious, and the two fictitious persons are intruded into Christ's genealogy through his mother Mary, which I say is bad. The more so if they print a patchwork quilt without a single Greek manuscript that reads precisely that way. Not only that, if you will check the critical apparatus in either Nestialat or the UBS editions, those critical apparatuses have misrepresented the evidence so that they hide the fact that no single Greek manuscript has the precise text they have printed. It is precisely a veritable patchwork quilt. Now I appeal to Metzer again. In his presentation of the committee's reasoning, in this case, he writes, quote, "The committee adopted what seems to be the least unsatisfactory form of text." End quote. No, really, is that not a good candidate for chutzpah of the year? Okay, the UBS editors concoct their own reading and proclaim it to be the least unsatisfactory. Now, what's wrong with people ahead, someone who can do that? Just what might be unsatisfactory about the reading of over 95% of the Greek manuscripts, except that it doesn't introduce any difficulties. Those four men were determined on introducing difficulties. They did it on purpose. Well, if you want to really check into it, I'm not going to read all this, but there is a complete confusion in the Egyptian camp, if I can call it that. And it must go back to the 2nd century. And that probably came about by several easy transcriptional errors, simple copying mistakes. I spell that out down there. I'm not going to bother you with that now. You can check it back later if you want to. I now go down to the bottom of that paragraph. I say the total confusion in Egypt does not surprise us, but how shall we account for the text and apparatus of Nestialat and UBS and assistants? They hid the evidence. And whatever possessed the editors of NASB, NRSV, TEV, LB, Berkeley, etc., to embrace such an egregious error. Going on now, I will now go on to Luke 9 and verse 10. Alain. Here we have something that's even a little more bothersome, perhaps. About 98% of the Greek manuscripts, including A, C, and W, they went into a deserted place belonging to a town called Bethsaida. This is where the feeding of the 5,000 happened. 0.5%, Codex B, and a different, not quite correct, Papyrus 75, have into a town called Bethsaida. And so on. Codex D has its own reading. Codex Aleph and another 0.5% have a deserted place and a number of other variants. So what's the difficulty? Well, the critical text has Jesus and company going into Bethsaida. So it says, into. But in verse 12, that same text, the disciples say they are in a deserted area. Therefore, a contradiction is introduced. That is to say, the critical text contradicts itself. In verse 10, it says one thing, and in verse 12, 2 verses later, it says something else. Not only that, but the critical text here is also at variance with the critical text in the parallel passages in Matthew 14:13 and Mark 16:31 and 2. So that set up a contradiction with what they had themselves done in Matthew and Mark. If you'll check it, if you go back and look, you'll see that in Matthew 14, all texts have Jesus going to a deserted place, and the disciples say that's what they are. In Mark 6:31, all texts have Jesus going to a deserted place, and so on. So The editors of the critical text, eclectic text, not only make Luke contradict himself, but they set Luke against both Matthew and Mark. And of course, the modern versions do not surprise us. They go along and do the same thing. Well, once upon a time, someone said to me, well, that's just peanuts, small stuff. Don't you have a serious case? Well, okay. Someone raised the question. As a matter of fact, yes, I do. But before going back to the errors, which I promised to do, I will now consider what I consider to be two serious cases. And the first one is found in John chapter 1 and verse 18. Is Jesus the only begotten Son, as in 99.6% of the manuscripts? Is he an only begotten God in 0.3%, or the only begotten God as in 0.1%? If you follow the critical text, which has an only begotten God, you have a serious anomaly being introduced, because God as God is not begotten. But the critical text calls him a begotten God. Well, think about this a bit. This is serious. The human body and nature of Jesus Christ was indeed literally begotten in the Virgin Mary by the Holy Spirit. But God the Son has existed eternally. An only begotten God is so deliciously Gnostic that the apparent Egyptian provenance of this reading makes it doubly suspicious. This, by the way, it would also be possible to render the second reading as only begotten God, emphasizing quality, and this seems to have appealed to some who see in it a strong affirmation of Christ's deity. Curiously, however, so far as I know, no version, none that I've seen, gives that rendering. They just don't do that. That would be a possibility, but no one does it. Again, if Christ received his godhood through the begetting process, then he cannot be the eternally pre-existing second person of the Godhead. Not only that, only begotten is not analogous to firstborn. If by firstborn you are referring to priority of position. Why not? Because that would place the Son above the Father. So no matter how one looks at it, the critical text reading introduces a serious anomaly, and they do it on the slimmest of evidence, like really poor. In those manuscripts, as I said, Hoskier demonstrated 2 + 2 = 4. They are poor manuscripts. They're not good. Poor quality. Just because they're old doesn't mean they're good. Satan is old. Does that make him good just because he's old? Just being old does not make it good. Matter of fact, why did it survive? Probably because it was so bad no one wanted to use it. If it had been used, it would have been worn out. Books wear out, okay? If you use a book, you wear it out, right? I've worn out about 6 Bibles in my short life. I'm here about to complete 88 years. If you use a book, it wears out. So how can a book last for 1,600 years? Well, because it wasn't used. And why wasn't it used? Now, going back to the text, probably monogenes, only begotten, is intended to mean something more than just monos, that's only. I assume that the Holy Spirit knew how to write decent Greek, as also John presumably knew how to write decent Greek, and he knew the difference between monogenes and monos. Monogenes is only begotten. And there are a few possible exceptions in Luke 7:12, even though for reasons of style, a translator may put the only son of his mother, that's the name, the dead boy name. We have to understand that he was her own offspring, not an adopted son. The same holds true for things like Luke 8:42 or 9:38, Hebrews 11:17. With reference to the promise and to Sarah, Isaac was indeed Abraham's only begotten, even though, in fact, he had other sons with other women. Note that in Genesis 22, verse 12, and Verse 16, God himself called Isaac Abraham's only son. God himself did that. John uses monogenes 5 times, always referring to the Son of God. You'll see that in John 1:14 and 18, 3:16 and 18, and 1 John 4:9. I really see nothing whatsoever in the whole New Testament usage to justify the rendering unique, as you see in some versions. That's a pure invention, as far as I can see. I'm not through yet with this. There's good old Papyrus 75, which is the oldest one we have here. Appears to have a conflation of the first 2 readings, and that's curious. But it demonstrates that the discrepancy presumably had arisen in the 2nd century. Why do I say this? Well, because by the way, I'm a linguist. I'm a PhD in linguistics, by the way. Articles modify nouns, not adjectives, when in a noun phrase, such as we have here. So the article is part of the variation unit, and you have to keep that in mind or you're going to get loused up. Now, most modern versions avoid a straightforward rendering of the critical text here. NIV offers God the only, bracket, Son, close bracket. It's a bad translation of a bad text. But a subsequent revision, they put God the one and only. That's a pious fraud. None of the variants has that meaning. It's a pious fraud. That's all it is. Today's English version has the only one who is the same as God. Well, it's only slightly better. Now, the NASB actually renders the only begotten God, the reading of Papyrus 75. Not to be outdone, Amplified serves us up a lovely conflation. The only unique Son, the only begotten God. Oh, hum. Really, this is a very serious question. We should follow 99.6% of the manuscripts. All of them better than any one of the other ones. P66, Olive, BC, P75, all bad manuscripts. It must be so. P66 has an average of 2 mistakes every verse. It's one of the worst manuscripts we have, although it's the earliest of any size. Going on, I'll come to a second, what I consider to be a serious case. It's in 1 Timothy 3:16. The question is, the text says, great is the mystery of godliness, I would say, of our religion. God was manifested in flesh. That's what 98.5% of the manuscripts read, precisely. 1%, including Aleph, that who was manifested in flesh. One manuscript, Codex D, has that was manifested in flesh, and there are a couple other variations as well. The problem here, apart from the theological import, we have a grammatical anomaly. Great is the mystery of godliness, who was manifested in flesh, is actually worse in Greek than it is in English. Now, just before I go on, I have a really long, about 15-page, no, well, I'm confusing myself, but I have a long footnote in my book, The Identity of the New Testament Text, 4, actually it's about the 7th edition, but in this one, 4, on pages 115 through 17, it's all footnote, where I really go into this reading. If you really want to see it torn apart piece by piece. Here I'm just giving a once over lightly, as it were. Mystery, I'm going back now to Greek. Great is the mystery of God. That's worse in Greek than English, because in Greek, mystery is neuter in gender, while godliness is feminine in gender, but who is masculine in gender, and therefore it is without an antecedent. And that's bad grammar, all right? Pronouns have an antecedent, and they have to agree with that antecedent. And of course, there's a theological problem. We'll get to that maybe in a bit, but people are so determined to. This is one of the strongest texts declaring the divinity of Jesus as God. God was manifest in flesh. So, of course, people who don't want to recognize Jesus as God will go to any length to get rid of it. They love, therefore, the reading of Codex Aleph. Since Codex B does not have the so-called pastoral epistles, Codex B is not extant here, which is why it's not listed. Oh, in an effort to defend who, people, it's commonly argued, they will try to say that the second half of verse 16 was a direct quote from a hymn, but they do not produce any evidence. There is not a solitary shred of evidence to that effect. And without evidence, that claim begs the question. I have a footnote here that I'm going to take time to read. A pronoun normally requires an antecedent, but quoted material might provide an exception. Thus, for instance, in 1 Corinthians 2:9 is sometimes offered as an instance. The quote from Isaiah 64, verse 4, begins with a pronoun, without a grammatical antecedent in the Greek text. Although mystery in verse 7 presumably would be the referential antecedent. However, the words from Isaiah are formally introduced as a quotation, as it is written. Whereas, of course, the material in 1 Timothy is not. So there's no valid analogy. Colossians 1:13 or 1:15 have been suggested also as analogies for who? They're even claimed as hymns without evidence. No objective support for that, absolutely. Not only that, the antecedent of the relative pronoun in Colossians 1:15 is the Son in verse 13, and the antecedent of the relative pronoun in verse 13 is the Father in verse 12. So again, there's absolutely no valid analogy. Going back up now to my main text. Oh, okay, a passage has some poetic qualities. Is that a sin? Is that a crime? Oh, it has some poetic qualities. So what? Of course, who is nonsensical. So most versions, most modern versions that follow the critical text here, they take evasive action. NEB and ASB have he who. Phillips has the one. NRSV, Jerusalem TV, and IB just render he. Berkeley actually put who. Oh well. The Latin reading, Codex D, the mystery that at least makes sense, because the mystery is neuter in gender. So that makes sense. The mystery that, at least it grammatical sense. However, the true reading, as attested by 98.5% of the Greek manuscripts, is precisely God. Now you have to understand, this is simply a very easy case of a transcriptional error. Let's see if you can see this. In the early days, names for God, but also things like man or sky, were abbreviated. So the abbreviation for God, which is theos, is just the theta and the sigma. Now the pronoun who is, as you see here, omicron, sigma, and this down here is the neuter one, like in Codex D, is that. As you see, the difference between God and who is just two little marks up here. And with a scratchy quill pen, those could be weak, and over time they could just simply fade out, or someone could be distracted and forget to write them. But you see that the difference between God and who is very slight, and that could easily have happened without being a deliberate alteration. Probably, though, since who is nonsense, the Latin reading what probably was a correction trying to make sense out of the bad pronoun who, which would therefore mean that this all happened very early on. perhaps as early as the 2nd century. So, the reading who can be explained as an easy transcriptional error. So why follow something like that on such slim, poor evidence? Whatever the intention of the editors of critical text, their text, as a matter of fact, emasculates the strong statement of the deity of Jesus Christ, besides being a stupidity. What is a mystery about any human male being manifested in flesh? Will you explain that to me, please? All human beings have bodies. Well, the variant who is an aberration. It is stupid, just plain stupid, and it makes the verse stupid. Godliness who? Nonetheless, most modern versions, they insist on printing the stupidity. Impressive. They are to be pitied. Why? Because there's an accounting coming up. We're going to have to give an account for everything that we did. Okay. That was the 2 serious cases that I said someone wanted a serious case. I gave you 2 of them. Now, before going back to the errors, that's what I'm talking about, supposedly errors and contradiction, I want to take up 2 serious cases of omission. Why am I doing that? Because the so-called critical text is really an eclectic text. It omits so many words and phrases, and even whole verses, that it is 10 pages shorter than either a majority text or the Textus Receptus. No, don't you think that's just a little bit too much? Cut out 10 pages of God's Word. Do you remember what the glorified Jesus said in Revelation 22 and verse 19? The glorified Christ, he said, if you take out 1 word, you don't get into the holy city. 1 word. What happens for people who cut out 10 pages? Okay, now I'm going to take up 2 nasty little cases of omission. The first one is in Luke 22, verses 43 and 44. This is the Lord sweating blood. Now, almost 99% of the Greek manuscripts have the verse, that is, both verses 43 and 44, including Aleph and D and Q. Less than 1% omit the verses, as in Papyrus 75, A, B, and TW. Now here, the critical text includes the 2 verses, but they put it in double brackets. And you have to understand what those double brackets mean. That means that they are telling you that it's not genuine. And they give it a grade A, that means it's virtually certain. So if they were just saying, they should have been consistent and simply omitted, because they were saying that this was not part of the original text. Well, let's think about this a minute. Okay, first, 99% of the manuscripts have it. The question is, where did this information come from? See, this is important information. It's recorded only here. It's not in any one of the other Gospels. So why cut it out on such poor basis? Let me read again what has been omitted. Then an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him, and being in anguish, he prayed with full concentration. Then his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. That's what has been cut out by less than 1% of the manuscripts. Again, I ask, where did that information come from? Remember the disciples? What were they doing? They were sleeping. And when you're asleep, what can you see? And it was night besides, and they didn't have electric lights back then. There was no way they could see that, because they were stones throw. They were probably at least 20 yards, if not 30 away. They just couldn't see what was happening. So the disciples were not the source of this information. Luke must have received it from on high, as he himself claims. Luke chapter 1, verse 3. He says he got it from on high, anno then. But if Luke did not write this information, as your critical text editors want, where did it come from, I ask again? And how could a later edition come to dominate 99% of the Greek manuscripts, the total global transmission down through all the centuries? No. Please, Luke certainly wrote both verses, and he wrote them precisely in the place where they are found. Why do I say that? Well, Codex C and 0.4% of the manuscripts place these verses after Matthew 26:39, which is why I made that last comment. One more. I'm going to take up now the case of the angel stirring up the water, the place at the swimming pool, if you like, at Bethesda, the tank. John 5, the second half of verse 3 and all of verse 4. Over 99% of the Greek manuscripts have that information about the water being stirred. Less than 1% omitted. The trouble is, you see, if you go back and read that, the omissions make the report virtually meaningless. The information is necessary to understand why those people were there. Look, they're there. Sun, rain, I don't know if they were there all night. Day after day, week after week, month after month. In the case of the man that Jesus healed, he'd been there for years. No. Those people were not there for no reason. Obviously, people were healed from really nasty diseases, bad stuff. Obviously, people were healed, or else no one would be there. Why are they going to be there instead of being in the comfort of home? So if you cut out the bit about the angel, you're simply destroying the account. They're meaningless. There's no point. Why do it with less than 1%? And that 1% inferior manuscripts. I can argue that the man who produced P66 did not know Greek. The guy who produced P75 did not know Greek. Why? Because by the many errors that they make, but the type of errors, show that P75 copied, I think it was letter by letter, and 66 syllable by syllable. And if you know a language, you copy phrase by phrase, or at the very least word by word. If you copy syllable by syllable or letter by letter, that's because you do not know what you're doing. And that's the case of both Papyrus 66 and 75. Just by the way, and as I've already said, Aleph and B disagree over 3,000 times in the four Gospels. They are bad manuscripts, not to mention the rest of them. Okay. Lamentably, most modern versions do the same thing. Okay, NIV and ASB, etc., on into the night. Now, curiously enough, verse 7 also mentions the churning of the water, but none of those manuscripts omits verse 7, as they should have done if they wanted to get rid of the all mention of the stirring of the water. Why didn't they omit verse 7? Now, that's not all. Things like NIV and ASB, New Living Translation, whatnot, they have footnotes that say that the angel was of the Lord, and they say that following perhaps 2% of the Greek manuscripts. Those 2% of inferior quality. They not only that, they use the word few to refer to 1,700. Well, that's a dishonest use of the English language. You do not use the word few to refer to 1,700 against half a dozen. It's dishonest. That's what they do. They use the word few for 1,700 against 7 or something. Oh dear. But let's think about this, about the angel. You see, you may be aware that angels can be both good and fallen. Okay, the text says very plain. The Lord himself, the Lord Jesus said in Matthew 25, that the lake of fire was prepared for the devil and his angels. That's sovereign Jesus said that. So we have good angels and we have fallen angels. We call them demons normally. So the question is, which was it? Was it a good one or a bad one? Of course, I can't prove it. I wasn't there. And of course, the angel would not be visible. So how did John know there was an angel? He says, he doesn't say that people thought it was. He says that it happened. I would say that almost, in my mind, almost certain this was a demon, a fallen angel, because this was a sadistic procedure. Just now and again, sort of a thing, condemned all those poor people to the added discomfort of being there all the time instead of being at home. Not to mention the despair of the guy like the guy that Jesus healed. He says, when the Lord says, wait, I don't have anyone to throw me into the water. Literally, that's what the Greek text. I don't have anyone to throw me into the water. Look, if it's a matter of a split second, first guy that touches the water after the water starts to go, people had nice husky slaves there to throw them at the water, literally. Because a split second made the difference whether you're healed or not. And don't you know the demons would really enjoy seeing the image of God being humiliated in that fashion. Well, I take it for myself, I can't prove it, but I take it that what we had here was in fact a demon. And the demons can cure. Okay, Satan can heal. Sure, he can cause disease, but he can also heal it. I take it that sadistic behavior is typical of Satan and not of God. Well, those were two cases of omission that I wanted to take up just to show that the critical text has some nasty omissions which do make a difference, as a matter of fact. There's no doctrinal problem here, but it simply makes the text meaningless if you cut out the bit about the moving of the water. Okay, that's where I'm going to stop for this video. Next video, God willing, we will carry on. I will start with Matthew 10 and verse 10 next time, God willing. Thanks for watching, and God bless.